Greetings all and welcome to Esoteric Babble. Today's babbling is going to inaugurate interviews, interviews with other live human beings. And today we have one of the best, one of the greatest people, one of the kindest, and Schuyler Kempton. Now, Schuyler, I'll turn it over to you in a minute and you can say a few things. Just let me know if I've got this right. I think you've lived your entire life in this universe, in this part of the multiverse. Is that correct? Have I?
That's true.
Okay, I haven't disclosed too much. Now, we're both, I think, coming from kind of undisclosed bunkers, right? So I don't want to give too much away, but uh, if that's correct, let me know if
Yes.
it's not. But yeah, but yeah, I turn it over to you. What brings us together on this fine day?
Yeah. We're going to be talking about an open question. And I
Right,
think this will be the beginning of a few open questions.
that's right.
Um, and so today's open question is on spirituality and environmentalism. I think we're speaking today from not from a place of expertise,
Right.
but from a place of curiosity and
Mm.
exploration.
Yes, I never speak
And
from a place of expertise, so
yeah, me neither.
uh,
Um, yeah, so I just wanted to I had a few thoughts about spirituality and environmentalism.
well, I love the topic. I think it's a great topic. So yeah, why don't you go ahead and you lead us into this?
Sounds good. Um, so I think the big question is can spirituality inform environmentalism and vice versa? Um, can spirituality be part of something that has to do sort of with um, politics in a very, very broad sense, not
Mm-hmm.
partisan politics, but sort of the decisions about how we're going to live, how we're going to live with each other, with
Right.
other non-human beings,
Sure.
um, and maybe can environmentalism or engagement with the environment and our world be part of spiritual practice,
Mhm.
to put it the reverse way. And so I'm going to argue that it can.
Good.
I'll talk about kind of two topics related to spirituality and how it informs environmentalism. Um,
Very good.
and
Very
so,
good.
so first of all, I think environmental destruction can be responded to with love and compassion, and so you can put that in different ways depending on your spiritual tradition. So it could be love and kindness, it could be agape love,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that environmental destruction calls for a compassionate response. And so, why is that? I think first because of the immense suffering that's endured by humans and non-humans because of environmental destruction. With
Yes.
extinction of species, loss of life,
Mm-hmm.
natural disasters affecting humans,
Right.
and I think that we can very easily kind of abstract environmental crises. But I think at the core, it really has to do with suffering. There are people and there are non-humans that are suffering
Mm-hmm.
because of environmental destruction. And so I think if we're concerned about compassion, about love, and that's part of our spiritual practice, I think that environmental destruction provides a spiritual calling. And another reason, maybe because the environment, because nature, because all of us and all other beings are sacred, and this is articulated in some indigenous religions, that there's a sacredness to the natural world, and maybe it's because looking at it from maybe a monotheistic perspective, because nature comes from God.
Right.
Maybe it is God.
Mm-hmm.
These are kind of
Yeah.
two slightly different ways of putting it. And something we spoke about, Charles, from a Buddhist perspective, is maybe there's something sacred. Buddhists might not use that word, but something like sacred, because
Mm-hmm.
all of this comes from emptiness.
Right.
We come from
Right.
emptiness. Animals come from emptiness. Plants come from
Yeah.
emptiness. All the things we create comes from emptiness. Everything in the material world and the mental world comes from emptiness.
For sure. Yes.
And um, and lastly, on love and compassion, defending life on Earth is a powerful experience. I think I haven't um, engaged with it as much as I would like to in the future, but even just sort of reading about people who have been more engaged on the front lines of defending the Earth,
Mm-hmm.
it's very powerful,
Yes.
and I think it can be a part of spiritual practice. Um,
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely.
that's one point about love and compassion and spirituality and environmentalism. Um, and the second point is interconnectedness.
Mm.
So the philosopher Joanna Macy, who was inspired by Buddhism and deep ecology and systems theory, says, quote, "We are a living part of a living planet," end quote.
Mm.
So that's a big claim. We're a living part of a living
Yes.
planet, and it's a very spiritual claim. Potentially,
Mm-hmm.
it's a scientific claim. Um, and I think if we are in some sense not separate from other living beings, then that provides a powerful case for defending all life on Earth.
Sure. Yeah.
If we're not separate from other human beings, then that provides a lot of substance to a claim like the classic industrial workers of the world labor slogan: "An injury to one is an injury to all."
Yes.
Maybe
Yeah.
that's literally true.
Yeah.
And I think that there's I'll get into some of the complications around this claim, and maybe we're not separate. But I'll just kind of put that out there to begin with,
Yeah.
and maybe we're not so separate from other living beings. So then we should care about each other. We should care about other non-humans. We should care about the environment. And it makes me think of Indra's net. I
Yeah.
don't know if
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah. Sure.
pronouncing Indra
Uh-huh.
right,
Yeah.
but this idea of an infinite net. At every intersection on the net or every nexus on the net,
Mm-hmm.
there's a jewel that reflects every other jewel.
Right. Beautiful image.
And I think I've heard that if all the jewels reflect every other jewel, then everything that affects one jewel would affect every other
Mm-hmm.
jewel.
Right.
I think that would make sense logically
Yeah.
if we think about this image. So we can put that in terms of the environment, in terms of the living world. Everything that affects one being affects every other being.
Right. For sure.
And so we all have really a personal interest in what affects other living beings.
Certainly. Certainly.
And so that's a very deep interconnection. And I think just from a scientific perspective, even not thinking about spirituality, there's this inextricable link between humans and the non-human world. I think one kind of eureka moment for me thinking about environmentalism and thinking about nature is, there really isn't a separation between humans and the human world and the natural world. Everything that we make, everything that humans make, comes from nature. We may have remixed it in certain ways.
Yeah, sure.
But it comes from the earth.
Yeah.
Everything, the economy depends upon the products of the earth, as well as human labor. Everything comes from the earth. Everything comes from the universe, to put it more broadly.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so there's this inextricable link. And on a religious level, I think that the concept of non-dualism is really interesting here. So I'm going to kind of introduce this idea of non-dualism. I think there's a really good post on this blog called Love of All Wisdom by Amod Lele. I'm not necessarily a huge fan of all of Lele's work, but I think this is a really good post. It's called Perennial Non-Dualism. And the argument basically is that there are a lot of religious thinkers who argue for non-dualism, and they come from many different traditions. So I'll just read a quick quote. Quote, "That core idea is that the truest, most ultimate reality should not be identified with the many plural, distinct things we typically observe and the distinctions between them. Rather, the true reality is ultimately one, or at least a literal translation again, not two and
Mm-hmm.
not more than two either.
Mm-hmm.
End quote. So there's kind of more on that. But it has to do with collapsing the distinction between subject and object.
Right on.
Which is quite interesting because
Mm-hmm.
it's leads into language philosophy.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
But I think if we kind of accept a non-dual perspective, interconnectedness makes sense.
Yes. Yes. For sure.
And the last point I'll make is the debate around this in Buddhism. There's some debate, I believe, about interconnectedness and Buddhism. So Devon Thomas Jones on the blog A Blue Chasm argues that the Buddha presented dependent arising in a temporal context, so in terms of time, so that there were these things that arose, and this is why we have karma, this is why we are in samsara, and we have to we actually have to get through these things that have arisen, that have caused us karma, and to get to nirvana.
Right.
But Devon Thomas Jones argues that it also makes sense in a spatial context, so as in dependent arising between beings, that there's an interconnectedness between beings, and that maybe this could be a key to awakening in our context, that we tend not to see the relationship between beings. And so this is a debate in Buddhism. What's I find interesting is that the orthodox view about dependent arising is that there's kind of a problem with this dependent arising, because it leads to karma. Sure. And so there's definitely some philosophical intricacies here,
sure.
and interconnectedness per se, I think this author argues is not a Buddhist concept, but perhaps it's not a Buddhist concept.
Yeah, right. Yeah, sure. Yeah,
and I think maybe in addition to Joanna Macy's work, one other prominent Buddhist philosopher, and obviously a very influential Buddhist teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, talks about interconnectedness in one of his books, Pieces Every Step. He talks about inner being, and he talks about the idea that we can see the universe in a single sheet of paper.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So I'll just read quickly part of this chapter on inner being. Quote, "If you're a poet, you will see clearly that there is a cloud floating in the sheet of paper. Without a cloud, there will be no rain. Without rain, the trees cannot grow. And without trees, we cannot make paper." End quote. And he continues with all the other beings and all the other parts of nature that are necessary for the piece of paper to exist.
Very powerful.
And he says, quote, "The fact is that this sheet of paper is made up only of non-paper elements." End quote.
Yeah, interesting, right.
So I think that's a fascinating Buddhist teaching on interconnectedness in an environmental context.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's wonderful.
So I think that's what I got, Charles.
Well, that was, first of all, I have to applaud you for being so cogent and succinct and deep. If I were to say the same thing, I would still be meandering, for another hour or two. So applause there. Now, one thing that it seems unfortunate in our day and age, and I don't think that, I don't know that history had to unfold the way it did, but do you suppose, or correct me if I'm wrong, that whenever environmentalism is brought up, it's immediately seen to be a liberal thing? And I guess to put that another way is there are people, I won't mention names, who think that the word environment is very vague, or environmentalism means you hate capitalism. And could we talk about that a little bit? Because I think that, first of all, I don't know that I take that argument in good faith, to be quite honest. I think that when you were talking about being on one, that the earth is one living being, like Gaia, maybe, I would think about, like, what if we're little red blood cells in a body? We don't want the body to get harmed, right? We want to do our job and we want to protect. So, and this is an example of me meandering because I'm not really focusing here, but it seems like it would not, that it could, it seems almost as if it would be a conservative principle to be environmentally minded. Does that make sense at all?
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think first of all that concern for the earth and defense of the earth really predates the liberal conservative
Sure,
distinction,
absolutely. Sure,
and this
sure.
this distinction in Western political thought.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
so it's much broader.
Mhm.
I think that I think that it I think that it's a useful frame because it can cut through some of the noise around
Yes,
politics.
right, sure,
Hopefully,
right.
um, it is political,
Mhm.
and I don't want to get too much into politics.
Right.
Well, too much into I don't know how to put it. Too much into contentious politics, right?
Yes,
I'm
sure,
trying to be
sure.
as uncontentious as possible.
Right,
But
for sure.
I think that I think that potentially environmentalism framed in a certain way hopefully can kind of cut through some of the um, political division.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I would think so. I would think that, seen correctly, environmentalism involves everybody. It's a concern for all of us,
yeah,
and a concern that we all are able to lead lives, to lead healthy lives, maybe. And again, I don't know that this is political or if it's just ideological, but I would say that there are certain people certain viewpoints or philosophies that would say greed is good. So, but that is going to speak to the few, I think. Would you agree with that? I mean, there are going to be a few people uh, who do in fact control things. So it might, yes, be in their. I don't know that it's ever in anyone's benefit not to be environmentally minded, but in the short term, I suppose, and this is part of the spiritual aspect, I think, is if we give in to greed, perhaps, then we get what we've gotten so far.
yeah,
You think that's a fair statement?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think go back a little bit what you said about environmentalism or environment being a vague thing. I think it's not an original thought of mine, but I think the word environmentalism or the word environment is unfortunately vague. And I
Mm-hmm.
think we probably need a better word because what we're talking
Right.
about really is it's concern for the living earth,
Yeah,
which
sure.
includes us.
Mm-hmm.
And so to say environment is I think is a bit vague, but that's one of the words that people know that we
Yeah,
have right now.
that's what we have, right.
Yeah.
That's what we have.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. Joanna Macy's work. She talks about it's a political and spiritual and yeah, political and spiritual project, and she talks about a shift in consciousness. Um, uh, in
Mm-hmm.
thinking about us as being living parts of a living planet. And it's tricky because I think that something like a shift in consciousness, it's not something that should be brought on by the state or by a political
Right.
party.
Right, for sure. Sure.
But it perhaps works the other way around. The shift in
Mm-hmm.
consciousness can propel political change that can be done in sort of in a way that incorporates, incorporates people from different religious perspectives, of course, and different value perspectives.
Mhm.
But I think that it is a significant shift thinking about us as yes, as individuals, but also as part of a greater whole, in some sense, interconnected with other people, with non-human beings. I think it's a big shift, a big political and sort of philosophical shift, because there is sort of a sense of individualism, or sort of thinking about atomized individuals, and maybe at best families and communities.
Right.
But I think that's definitely a shift, and it has spiritual and political significance, and hopefully it's broad enough that it can appeal to people of different spiritual and political perspectives.
Yeah, I think so. And I think going back to the compassion aspect, because I mean, we do live in a world where optics matter, and I guess it always has. There's always been like a PR or some kind of spin on things, I suppose. But I think that it would be important that if we're, what you're saying to me, sort of like we have to start individual to individual. And so if we're talking to someone who has this idea that environmentalism is anti-people, anti-capitalism, I just want to make a living, we have to, I would say we should come at that from a compassionate point of view and say, yeah, your livelihood is important too, obviously. I don't think being pro-environment is in any way trying to keep people from making a living. And it's actually, I think, just the opposite. But I guess that's one thing that to help us cut through this sort of division that I don't even know is, I think divisions benefit certain people, right? So if we can work through divisions like this, or seeming divisions, that it's a benefit to everyone, because then we can start to breed compassion and show how. I mean, I think that these things, it's not too hard to show that we need to have a safe, or we need to have a habitable environment in which, for us to make livings, for us to pay the bills, we're going to have an air that we can breathe. And is anything that I'm saying making sense at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that the economy and the environment are interconnected.
Right.
And when you get to specifics, it becomes complicated. Sometimes there are environmental policies that can have a negative economic effect for particular people, particular cases. And I think the answer to that, for me, speaking more specifically politically, is to have a strong social safety net, to have other jobs available, to have income available for people who don't have a job or who are transitioning. That is a key matter of justice. In the big picture, certainly, the environment and the economy are interconnected, and we need a healthy and a living earth. I do think, capitalism is a contentious topic, and people different people mean different things. I do think that that it may not be possible to have the focus on economic growth that we have had, and have a healthy ecological system. And this is, Joanna Macy makes this argument that if you just focus on one thing in your economic system, on economic growth, on sort of profit and growth, then the system is going to be thrown out of balance. There's definitely complicated things when it comes to what would happen if we shift away from focus on growth. And so I don't want to gloss over that. But I do think there are economic and political shifts that need to happen for the environment to be healthy and for the destruction to stop.
Sure.
And those details are those are the details that I think you can start working on maybe after you dive into the issue and after you kind of think about connecting the dots between environment and spirituality. So maybe it's beyond the scope of this conversation.
Sure.
But
specifics of absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and one thing that this is a good point, and this is where sometimes I think the metaphors can have unintended consequences, and sometimes they're good. But if we think that an economy is something that has to grow, or say, and I think we mentioned this before, and a good friend of mine says this all the time, like if you have a business that's functioning well, does it need to quote grow? We apply this metaphor of it being a living entity and think that therefore it must expand, but does it have to? And you're right, like I mean maybe if we could put the brakes on that a little bit. I mean it almost sounds sacrilegious to say that no, we don't have to grow the economy, but and I'm not an economist, this is just in me intuiting certain things, but I would think that uh, I mean, it would be equivalent to just because you can eat food doesn't mean you should. You can end up with problems of obesity that way. So I'm not sure that growth is necessarily a good thing. It's just something we're conditioned to. So anyway, that's one thing. Now, slightly, so when we speak about spirituality sometimes, often I think spirituality is very centered on the person, and I don't think it has to be, and I mean sometimes we think of like a monk sitting in a secluded forest somewhere, and like what effect does that monk have on the world, and there could be many effects, but I think this is a good point where spirituality, and I don't think it's ever just meant that. I think that um, our actions, every action and every thought and every verbal action should be considered, um, how would we say? I'm going to use another vague term, spiritually. Well, everything we think, say, or do should come from a good place, I think. And hopefully doing that would lead to a better environment. Do you think there's any, how can I say this? Would you recommend any specific practices to people or things to read, think about? I mean, you've already obviously mentioned some, but what would you recommend to someone who's maybe spiritual but hasn't thought maybe beyond just meditation and self-liberation?
Well, I'm at the beginning of the path. Beginning of the path in terms of spirituality, beginning of the path in terms of thinking about the environment.
Sure, me too.
And so I think it.
Well, say there are people who haven't even started the path. There's some people who don't even know there's a path. What would you say to those people?
Well, I think maybe going addressing the issue of if someone is focused sort of on the personal liberation, maybe hasn't thought about social, environmental applications of spirituality. I think I think that Buddhism is very strong in addressing that. When you meditate, a lot of Buddhist teachers say you want to dedicate your merit to somebody else or to people who are suffering or whatever.
Sure.
When you do meditation, loving kindness meditation, it's about being compassionate toward yourself and then extending that to others.
Yes, for sure.
I think I think that when you start to be mindful, I think you realize the connection between yourself and others, and that the extent to which your own happiness, your own well-being depends upon, not depends on others, but is connected with others.
Sure, certainly.
Insofar as you want to help others as part of your own spiritual path.
Absolutely. Yes.
And we are connected in some way with other people and non-humans every day. Being just being kind to others can be a spiritual practice. Being engaged in the world and trying to make the world a better place, in easing suffering, can be immensely spiritually powerful. And I think that maybe this is a little bit of a dodge, but I think I would just sort of say, the person who started the path and is looking for calm, looking for respite from issues they're having, such as I am, myself.
Yeah, sure. Me too.
Maybe I would just say, keep going. You'll very shortly see how this connects with others.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I do agree with that. I mean, I think that, and I believe, I'm not sure where it is in the canon, but I think the Buddha even mentioned something like, if you had a cup of water and you drank almost all of it, and instead of throwing out the water, you offer it to animals, like you're building good karma that way. And I think that the more, and I think that you've said it a lot, and I didn't really comment on it yet, but the non-human world is important too. We, I don't want to bring this down, but I think you can go to animalkillcount.com or something, and that number right now, it's kind of a real-time update of, like, in the United States, how many animals have been slaughtered this year.
Yeah.
It's a staggeringly high number.
Yeah.
And I do think that as we go on and we extend, we always want to expand the bubble of what gets included into, hey, this being should be happy. And really, from the Buddhist point of view, there is no one who's ever outside of that. The most vicious person, you want that person to be well. And and I think that's true in Christianity. I mean, I think that's the whole thing of give your coat, if someone, turn the other cheek. I mean, these are real things that we don't always think about. But they have a spiritual, obviously there's a depth there. And so, I think you're right. I think just keep going, and that the more we expand our true love, our metta for all living beings, that that in itself begins the liberation process, because it starts to loosen our I want to grasp. You start to give instead, and that maybe hacks away at kind of our Darwinian ego that just wants to, propel genes into the next generation.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, when you give compassion to yourself, it's not a process of trying to get something. It's not, I'm going to be compassionate to myself, I'm going to go buy this, that's
right.
That's not what the meta practice is.
Yeah.
And when you, I think that too often, when you're trapped in competition and trying to get ahead for yourself, you're actually not giving compassion to yourself.
Right.
When you give compassion to yourself, just thinking about yourself, just about giving compassion to yourself, I think that maybe is the first step in breaking that that tether to 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 grasping.
Absolutely.
And then I think it's a short step from there to being able to give compassion to others and engaging in the world.
Absolutely. Now, Schuyler, I'm holding up. No one can see this. We're at the 3-minute mark.
Yes.
We've hit the warning track here. So,
Yeah.
and this has been amazing, and this has gone too fast, and we will fix this in the future so we can have longer conversations, which we'll have very soon because this needs. I feel like we're halfway through this. But is there something you would like to say to just sort of conclude today's short little conversation? And we'll have more very soon. Anything to get in before we wrap up this session?
Yeah. I would just say that to invite everybody to play a role in defending the earth, defending ourselves, and invite people to be curious about how that connects with spirituality. It can be very daunting to try to do with something about these environmental crises, these social crises. I think perhaps combining that engagement with spirituality is a way to make it manageable, to way to make it fulfilling, and
that's very well said.
And sustainable, frankly.
Right. Yeah, it's hard if you're trying to do it all on your own. Obviously, that's difficult, and having camaraderie is nice. But I do think also, like, if I'm understanding what you say correctly, that the spirituality actually helps the defense of the earth, is what you're saying. Like that can even give you a broader foundation, perhaps.
I believe so.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I guess we'll leave it there. This is wonderful, and we'll do this again very soon. Very, very, very soon. This has been wonderful. But yeah, Schuyler, peace and joy. And this is the day before Thanksgiving, so we have a lot to be thankful for. And I'm thankful that you've come and we've started these discussions. So be well.
Thank you, Charles.
All right. Thank you. Take care.